Hello everyone and welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about 5 things which you should never do in a brand new vehicle. Now the definition of brand new of course will change depending on the vehicle, but generally we're going to be talking about the first 1,000 miles of which you're going to be braking in your vehicle. So check your owner's manual, it'll tell you, what that break-in period is, but we're going to be talking about 5 things which you shouldn't be doing during that time. Now I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. In the event of an emergency, ignore everything in this video and just do whatever you need to do to be safe. Like I said, I think it goes without saying, but some people out there may value their car over their own life. You shouldn't do that. You should value your own life. So, the biggest things we're going to get into, of course, have to relate to the engine. And these are going to get somewhat controversial, but one of the biggest things about breaking in a new vehicle is breaking in the engine and making sure that these piston rings seat properly on your cylinder wall. So on your cylinder wall, you've got that freshly honed cylinder bore, and you want to make sure you get a nice seal between that and these piston rings. Now these piston rings have some spring tension in them, which allow them to expand out and rub against that cylinder wall, but that's not really what's going to be doing the majority of wearing in this piston ring on that cylinder wall. Really, you've got the combustion process occurring on top of it. Those gases are going to pass in here. They're going to get in these gaps, get behind the piston ring, and force that piston ring out and expand it out on that cylinder wall, and that pressure is what's going to wear down that cylinder bore. Now, you don't need an excessive amount of pressure to do this. This is where it gets kind of controversial. So points 1 and 2, don't floor it, and point 2, don't bring it all the way up to, red line, to your highest RPM. And, there's certainly people out there who will say a hard break-in is necessary, but we're going to talk about, kind of why that's not true based on all the data that's out there, based on all the information that's out there, and based on what all the manufacturers out there recommend. And so basically what you're doing, like I said, you're sealing these piston rings up against that cylinder bore and wearing it down so you have a nice seal. Now, you don't want to do this too fast and with too much pressure. There's no reason. You can cause damage. If there are imperfections, you're going to wear down those imperfections too quickly. That could cause hot spots, which could cause problems. So you want a nice gradual wear of that cylinder bore with these piston rings so that you create that good seal. And some people out there will say, for performance, if you want maximum power, you need to floor it. You need to get that perfect seal. And the only way to do that is with super high pressure. But if you look at performance cars and what they recommend, this is not what they recommend doing. So just a few examples, starting with the Nissan GT-R. For the first 300 miles, they recommend not going over 50% throttle, and they recommend not going over 3,500 RPM. And that's for those first 300 miles. And so, as you can see, obviously the GT-R is a performance vehicle. Obviously, they want it to have the performance that you expect from it. Why would they recommend that if they didn't, believe that to be true? If, the best method of breaking in that engine was with lighter throttle applications and without going to super high RPM. Another interesting example is the new Acura NSX, and one of the cool things that they do is they break this in from the factory. And so they have a procedure where they put the equivalent of about 150 miles on the engine, varying the load and not exceeding 4,000 RPM on the engine. And what they say this does is that when the customer takes delivery of their new NSX, they can go straight to the track because they've already put in this engine break-in process. And so, from the factory, the car's good to go. You can take it out to the track. Now, why would Acura spend the time and spend the money on breaking in an engine, keeping it under 4,000 RPM, varying the load, if it wasn't necessary to do for the safety and performance of that engine? They wouldn't. It would be a waste of time and money, like I said. And so, these are just another example out there of a company which does a break-in from the factory. That's their procedure. Keep it under 4,000 RPMs, do the equivalent about of 150 miles, and then let the customer thrash it on the track on day one. So a cool thing that they do so that you don't have to do the break-in procedure. Another example is the Corvette, the new Corvette, the C7. They recommend, and they specifically say for performance reasons, you don't want to exceed 4,000 RPM, and you don't want to do full throttle starts in the new Corvette, basically in those first 500 miles. And then they have a separate procedure for the next 1,000, and they have, a total of 1,500 miles of break-in. But for those first 500, keep it below 4,000 RPM and don't floor it from a start. So, more recommendations out there. These are different companies. They're all saying very similar things. And I actually had the honor to speak with someone who worked in FCA's performance engine division. They actually have their own land speed record car where they took a 2-liter out of a Dodge Neon SRT4 and, boosted that up to, I believe, 800 horsepower. They had an absurd amount of boost in it. And, they were telling me their break-in procedure for that engine with 800 horsepower. And once again, it was varying the load, and it was changing changing the RPM, but not going too high. I believe the highest he went was 4,000 RPM. And I asked him, you work in this world, you have access to this data, is there any advantage of a hard break-in? And he said, absolutely not. There's no advantage to it. It's just a risk. And so it's an unnecessary risk. You can do a lighter break-in. Obviously, you don't baby the vehicle. Give it, decent throttle, give it half throttle, something like that. But you don't want to floor it because you can run into that risk of causing damage if you get things in there too hot where these imperfections lie. You want to wear them down more gradually rather than quickly. Now, yes, manufacturing tolerances have greatly improved and it's always getting better, but this doesn't necessarily eliminate the need for a break-in period. Typically what it just means is that the break-in periods will be shorter than they previously were as a result of better manufacturing tolerances. Okay, so we have points 1 and 2. Don't floor it. Don't bring it up to red line. And our third, we're going to be talking about don't use cruise control. And really the reason why you don't want to use cruise control is because you want to vary that engine RPM as you're driving. And when you set cruise control, you're just going to have one set engine RPM, especially with manual transmission vehicles, which obviously aren't going to shift for you. But basically you don't want to use cruise control because you don't want to keep it at a constant speed. You want to vary the engine's load and you want to vary the engine's speed so that it gets used to all these varying conditions and it properly wears it in. So, you can take that into consideration and think, maybe you shouldn't do a 1,000-mile road trip as the first trip in your car because you're just going to be sitting on the highway at one set speed, at one set throttle position, at one set RPM. And so you really want to vary the conditions for a proper break-in. Moving on to number 4, you want to make sure that you avoid short distance travel. And by short distance travel, what I mean is travel that doesn't let your engine fully warm up. You want to make sure that everything gets up to operating temperature during all of your trips, especially for those first 1,000 miles, because you want to make sure that you break everything in at operating temperature. You want to make sure you have proper oil flow, which is only going to happen once you get things up to operating temperature. And you also want to make sure that things are expanded to their final state so that when they're breaking in, for example, that cylinder, it's going to expand out and wear down that cylinder wall. And so you want to make sure it's at its operating temperature so that everything's in that expanded state, in its warmest state, so that you get that proper break-in. Now, that doesn't mean short distance travel as far as like driving around a city isn't going to be good. It's great to do that. Driving around a city, you vary your engine RPM, you vary your load, and that's great to do. You just want to make sure that things get up to operating temperature during each of your trips while you're braking in the vehicle. And finally, number 5, you want to make sure that during those first 1,000 miles or whatever it may be, you're not towing something super heavy, something, at its tow capacity. You may just want to avoid towing in general. And there's several reasons for this. First of all, it's going to be putting a higher load on your engine. That's obvious because you've got more weight, and to accelerate, you're going to need more power, and so you're going to be giving it more throttle. You want to avoid those full throttle applications, and so in doing so, the better idea is to just not tow for the first duration. Now, some vehicles are going to be designed more for it than others. For example, this Crosstrek says it can tow 1,500 pounds, but you may want to avoid it entirely because this isn't really a vehicle set up for towing until you've reached, the end of your break-in period so that you're not going full throttle. Now, there's 2 other reasons, and that comes down to your brakes and your tires, why you may not want to tow for those first few miles. Both of these have break-in periods, your brakes and your tires, and so you may not have as good of braking power, and you may not have as good a stopping power as a result of your tires, because you will have a film, essentially, from the molding process of those tires that can be left on there. So your stopping distance for the first couple hundred miles of your vehicle, of driving your vehicle, isn't going to be as good as it will be later on. And so in an emergency situation when you're towing, where you need that extra stopping power, it's good to wait until you know that your brakes and your tires are properly broken in. So thank you all for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below.